Oh, Madam Pence is so mad. I would be too if someone put that on my table. Who knew Melissa Grill had that kind of artistic talent? I love snooping around her office. Look at this beautiful version of the castle. That's why I came to Hogwarts and not Ilvermorny. It's much better. Whoa, are you reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone? That's one of my favorites. J.K. Rowling is the best biographer. Harry Potter is the man. I'm so excited to read this. Wait, do you mind if I read it with you? I really want to. Let's see, where were you? Oh, chapter 2 of The Vanishing Glass. This one is really creepy. Here we go. Nearly 10 years had passed since the Dursleys had woken up to find their nephew on the front step, but Privet Drive had hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front gardens and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been on the night Mr. Dursley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago, there had been lots and lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing a different colored bobble hat. But Dudley Dursley was no longer a baby, and now the photograph showed a large, blond boy riding his first bicycle on a roundabout at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed with his mother. The room held no sign at all of the other boy that lived in that house, too. Yet Harry Potter was still there, asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice that made the first noise of the day. Up! Get up! Now! Harry woke up with a start. His aunt rapped on the door again. Up! She screeched. Harry heard her walking toward the kitchen, and then the sound of the frying pan being put on the cooker. He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he'd been having. It had been a good one. There was this big flying motorbike in it. It had a funny feeling he'd had that dream before. His aunt was back outside the store. Are you up yet? She demanded. Nearly, said Harry. Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect on Duddy's birthday. Harry groaned. What do you say? What did you say? His aunt snapped. Nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could he have forgotten? Harry got slowly out of bed and started looking for socks. He found a pair under his bed, and after pulling a spider off of them, he put it on. Harry was used to spiders because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. When he dressed, he went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath all Dudley's birthday presents. There were so many. It looked as though Dudley had gotten even more than last year. The new computer he wanted, not to mention the second television and the racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise. Unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favorite punch bag was Harry, but he could not catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in the dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he did when he was, when he was, I have a cough, because he had to wear old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than Harry. Harry had a thin face, knobbly knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses held together with a lot of sellotape because all the times Dudley had punched him on the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead, which was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it for as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had got it. In the car crash when your parents died, she said, and don't ask any more questions. Don't ask questions. That was the first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry had turned over the bacon. Comb your hair, he barked, by way of a morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted at Harry to get a haircut. Harry must have had more haircuts than all of the rest of the boys in his class put together. But it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much neck, small watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on his thick, fat head. Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often thought Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put the plates of egg and bacon on the table, which was difficult as there wasn't much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting his presents. His face fell. 36, he said, looking up at his mother and father. That's 2 less than last year. Darling, you haven't counted Auntie Margie's presents yet. See, they're here under this bag, the big one for Mommy and Daddy. All right, 37 then, said Dudley, going red in the face. Harry, who could see a huge Dudley tantrum coming on, began wolfing down his bacon as fast as possible in case Dudley turned that table over. Aunt Petunia obviously scented danger too, because she said quickly, And we'll buy you another 2 on the way to the park. How's that, Popkin? 2 more presents, is that all right? Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally, he said slowly, So I'll have 30. 39, sweetheart, said Aunt Petunia. Oh, said Dudley, sitting down heavily and grabbing the nearest parcel. All right, then, Uncle Vernon chuckled. Little Tyke just wants his money's worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley. He ruffled Dudley's hair. At that moment, the telephone rang, and Aunt Petunia went to answer it, while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unwrap the racing bike, a Cinecamera, a remote-control aeroplane, 16 new computer games, and a video recorder. He was ripping the paper off a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came in from the telephone, looking both angry and worried. Bad news, Vernon, she said. Mrs. Figg's broken her leg. She can't take him. She jerked her head in Harry's direction like that. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day to adventure parks, hamburger bars, or the cinema. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mrs. Figg, a mad old lady who lived 2 streets away. Look at all the spiders on this page. I'm really glad I don't live in a cupboard under the stairs. No, Hogwarts is a much better place to live. Harry hated it at Mrs. Figg's. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Miss Figg made him look at photographs of her cats, every one she ever owned. Now what? Said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry as though he'd planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry for Mrs. Figg, but it wasn't easy when he reminded himself it would be a whole year before he had to look at Tibbles, Snowy, and Mr. Paws and Tufty all over again. We could phone Marge, Uncle Vernon suggested. Don't be silly, Vernon. She hates the boy. The Dursleys often spoke about Harry like this, as though he wasn't even there, or rather, as though he was something very nasty that couldn't understand them, like a slug. What about, what's her name, your friend Yvonne? On holiday in Majorca, snapped Aunt Petunia. You could just leave me here, Harry put out hopefully. He'd be able to watch what he wanted on television for a change, and maybe even have a go on Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked as though she'd just swallowed a lemon. And come back and find the house in ruins, she snarled. I won't blow up the house, said Harry, but they weren't listening. I suppose we could take him to the zoo, said Aunt Petunia slowly, and leave him in the car. That car's new. He's not going to sit in it. Dudley began to cry loudly. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It had been years since he'd really cried. But he knew that if he screwed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted. Dinky Duddydums, don't cry. Mummy wouldn't let him spoil your special day, she cried, flinging her arms around him. I don't want him to come, Dudley yelled between huge pretend sobs. He always spoils everything. He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gap in his mother's arm. Just then the doorbell rang. Oh, good Lord, they're here. said Aunt Petunia frantically. And a moment later, Dudley's best friends, Pierce Poskin, walked in with his mother. Pierce was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their backs while Dudley punched them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once when his friend was there. Half an hour later, Harry, who couldn't believe his luck, was sitting in the back of the Dursleys' car with Pierce and Dudley on the way to the zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with him, but before they left, Uncle Vernon had taken Harry aside. "I'm warning you," he said, putting his large purple face right up close to Harry's. "I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in the cupboard from now until Christmas." I'm not doing anything," said Harry. "Honestly." But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was, strange things often happened around Harry, and it was just no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once, Aunt Petunia, tired of Harry coming back from the barber's looking as though he hadn't been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short he was almost bald. Except for the fringe, which he kept to hide his horrible scar. That's why she kept it. He liked the scar. Dudley had laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day, where he was already laughed at for his baggy clothes and laughed at for his sellotape glasses. The next morning, however, he had got up to find his hair exactly as it had been before Petunia had sheared it off. He had been given a week in his cupboard for this, even though he had tried to explain that he couldn't explain how it had grown back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia had been trying to force him into a revolting old jumper of Dudley's, brown with orange bubbles. The harder she tried to pull it over his head, the smaller it seemed to become, until finally it wouldn't even have fitted a glove puppet. But certainly, it would have fit a glove puppet, but it wouldn't have fit Harry. Aunt Petunia decided it had shrunk in the wash, and to his great relief, he wasn't punished. On the other hand, he'd gotten into terrible trouble for being found on the roof of the school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him as usual, when, as much to Harry's surprise as anyone, there he was, sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys had received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress telling them Harry had been climbing the school buildings. But all he tried to do, as he shouted to Uncle Vernon through the locked door of the cupboard, was jump behind the big bins outside the kitchen door. Harry supposed the wind must have caught him mid-jump, taking him right up on the roof. But today, nothing was going to go wrong. It was even worth being with Dudley and Pierce to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't his school, his cupboard, or Mrs. Fig's cabbage-smelling, full-of-cat living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He liked to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank, and Harry were just a few of his favorite subjects. This morning, it was motorbikes. Roaring like maniacs, he said, "the young hoodlums," as a motorbike overtook them. "I had a dream about a motorbike," said Harry, remembering suddenly. "It was flying." Uncle Vernon nearly crashed the car into the one in front of it. He turned right around in his seat and yelled at Harry. His face, like a gigantic beetroot with a mustache, said, "Motorbikes don't fly!" Dudley and Pierce snickered. I know they don't," said Harry. "It's only a dream." But he wished he hadn't said anything. If there was one thing the Dursleys hated even more than him asking questions, it was his talking about anything, acting in a way it shouldn't. No matter if it was a dream or even a cartoon, they seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas. It was very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursleys bought Dudley and Pierce large chocolate ice creams at the entrance, and then, because the lady in the van had asked Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him away, they bought him a cheap lemon ice lolly. It wasn't bad either, Harry thought, looking it as they watched the gorilla, scratching his head and looking remarkably like Dudley, except he wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he'd had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dursleys so that Dudley and Pierce, who were starting to get bored with the animals by lunchtime, wouldn't fall back on their favorite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because his Knickerbocker glory wasn't big enough, Uncle Vernon bought him another one, and Harry was glad to finish the first. Harry felt afterwards that he should have known it was all too good to last. And believe me, it was. After lunch, they went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit windows all along the walls. Behind the glass, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Pierce wanted to see huge, poisonous cobras and thick, man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It could have wrapped its body twice around Uncle Vernon and crushed him into a dustbin. But at that moment, it didn't look in the mood. In fact, it was just sleeping. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. "Make it move," he whined to his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass. And y'all know they don't like that. The snake didn't budge. "Do it again," Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. "This is boring," Dudley moaned. He shuffled away. Harry moved in front of the tank and looked intently at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it had died of boredom itself. No company, even stupid people, drumming on their fingers on the glass like that to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having a cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitor was Aunt Petunia hammering on the door to wake you up. At least he got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened his beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on the level with Harry's. And it winked. I can't really wink. Harry stared. Then he looked quickly around to see if anybody was watching. They weren't. He looked back at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head towards Uncle Vernon and Dudley and then raised its eyes to the ceiling. It gave Harry a look that said, "I get that all the time." "I know," Harry murmured through the glass, though he wasn't sure the snake could hear him. "It must be really annoying." The snake nodded vigorously. "Where do you come from anyway?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at a little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. "Boa constrictor, Brazil." Was it nice there?" The boa constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry read on. "This specimen was bred in the zoo." "Oh, I see. You've never been to Brazil." The snake shook his head, As the snake shook his head, a deafening roar behind Harry made both of them jump. "Dudley! Mr. Dursley! Come look at the snake! You won't believe it!" Dudley came waddling toward them as fast as he could. "Out of the way, you," he said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell hard to the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast that no one else even knew how it happened. It was like that. 1 second, Pierce and Dudley were leaning right up against the glass like this. The next time, they leapt back with howls of horror. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass front of the boa constrictor's tank was gone, vanished completely. The great snake was uncoiling himself rapidly, slithering out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and ran for the exits. As the snake slid swiftly past him, Harry could have sworn he heard a low, hissing voice say, "Brazil, here I come. Thanks, amigo." The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. But the glass, he kept saying. "Where did the glass go?" The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of very strong, sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. Pierce and Dudley could only gibber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake hadn't done anything except snap playfully at their heels as it passed. But by the time they were back in Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Pierce was swearing it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry, at least, was Pierce calming down enough to say, "Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry?" Guys, look at this drawing. Isn't it great? Look at the giant snake. Oh, I'm so glad you're letting me read this with you. Uncle Vernon waited until Pierce was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Go, cupboard, stay, no meals," before he collapsed into a chair and Aunt Petunia had to run get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard much later, wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk going into the kitchen for some food. He lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years, 10 miserable years, as long as he could remember, ever since he'd been a baby and his parents had died in that car crash. He could remember being in the car crash when it happened. Sometimes when he strained his memory during long hours in the cupboard, he came up with a strange vision, a blinding flash of green and a burning pain on his forehead. This, he supposed, was the car crash. Though he couldn't imagine where all that green light had come from, he couldn't remember his parents at all. The aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he'd been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed of some unknown relation coming to take him away. But it never happened, and the Dursleys were his only family. Yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, the strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a violet top hat had bowed to him once while they were out shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously if he knew the man, Aunt Petunia had rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking old woman dressed in all green had waved merrily at him once on the bus. A bald man in a very long purple coat had actually shaken his hand in the street the other day and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing about all these people was the way they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to get a closer look. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated the odd Harry Potter and his baggy old clothes and broken glasses, and nobody liked to disagree with that gang. Excuse me. Well, that's the end of the chapter, guys. I wanted to keep reading. I see there's more students here now. I love reading to all of you. So next is chapter 3, The Letters from No One. Can't believe you haven't read this before. It's so good. I can't. I'm so excited. It's like I'm doing it all over again, just reading with you all. Oh, wait. I think I hear Madam Pince. She's coming.